Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Sentry. Sentry is the major uniform for this update, considering that he is a native tier 3 that can reach tier 4. And a lot of people are basically wondering whether Sentry is now the best character in PvP, not only in timeline, but across the board in all PvP modes, because he previously was before Knull got his uniform and tier 4 to dethrone him. I'm sure that a lot of people have already picked up Sentry's uniform, considering the hype around the Thunderbolts movie and the extra crystals that are provided from the anniversary. So if you're wondering what value this video will bring, I'll basically be breaking down what I believe is the most ideal build option for the character based on certain situations or circumstances, how to use the character in manual timeline, and how to counter Sentry in both manual and auto modes. For those that don't already have his uniform and are wondering how much of an improvement the new uniform makes over the old one, I'm obviously also going to be breaking down the differences between the uniforms and how they perform not only in PvE but also PvP. Just as a heads up, my Sentry is totally maxed out. The only thing that I'm lacking, I believe, is the Glory Odins. I only have the engraved versions of those, but everything else is pretty much at the very top. And just for reference, all my testing is done with a Brilliant Conquest on Sentry. I didn't actually test with a Brilliant Greed or Greed at all, but I did fight versus Greed Sentries, so I have a pretty good understanding of how the two builds compare, and I'll still do the breakdown in the timeline aspect of the video to give you my recommendations on those. The first test I did of Sentry in PvE was in World Boss Legend Kang on stage 50 and using his old uniform. Again, I'm not using a damage proc, and with this setup, having Ronin as the leadership support and having Ghost Panther as the other support, I actually wasn't able to complete this stage. I ran out of time in the last phase because I couldn't do enough damage, but finished with about 2 health bars remaining and around 10 seconds remaining in total for the actual fight. If you're not really interested in PvP and just want to use Sentry for fun in PvE, then a CTP of Rage is likely the easiest and best option. You can also utilize a single skill damage proc like an Energy or Destruction if you wanted to, but you kind of have to manage his proc a little bit once you have the ultimate, since you have to delay cancel some stuff. So CTP of Rage is likely your most ideal option there, but keep in mind that if you go this route, he won't really get much value in PvP, especially with the new uniform. With the new uniform and nothing else changing, I actually was able to complete the last phase of Kang, did enough damage to basically zero the meter, and I was able to complete the fight entirely 20 seconds faster than before, or with around 30 seconds remaining. For those that were hoping that this Sentry uniform would be a little bit more PvE oriented, considering that the old one was for PvP, I don't really think that that's the case. It is better in PvE, but the marginal increase that it provides is hardly enough to warrant saying that it is a PvE centered uniform or a PvE upgrade, especially after you see how much of an improvement it makes in PvP. By the way, if you're wondering what his rotation is with the new uniform, it's basically the same as it was before. You can do a quick cancel of the first and second skill to fill up your ultimate in tier 4 faster, but the main rotation is 4, delay cancel after he hits the ground, 5, cancel 3. Once you have your ultimate skill, you basically just do that exact same rotation, but finish with the 6th skill, and pretty much use the 7th skill or the tier 4 skill every time that you have access to it. You can get an even better idea of his PvE performance with the new uniform compared to the old one, since I also took him into ABX for the universal hero restriction, and again with no damage proc and the exact same leadership and support setup, I was able to score somewhere around 12.5 million. The hit count on the new uniform isn't really drastically different from the old one. It's essentially almost the same, and there isn't enough changes to his PvE kit to allow him to score that much higher than the old uniform. I pretty much ended up scoring almost exactly the same score, only off by a few 100,000, which could easily be just rotations and procs and things like that. I would say that if he was able to score around 14 million or more without a damage proc, that could warrant the character being used for score-based modes or even having a little bit more PvE value, but for the most part, at least for the Universal Hero Day, Wanda or Scarlet Witch is still going to hold the title there for the meta option. First things first, the old uniform had super guard break immunity on it. You can see here at the start of the clip that I'm freely able to move around the attacks that have super guard break on them. So typically if a character was hit by them, they would just be head rocked in place. You would just see the animation of them kind of having their head bobbing back and forth. But because he has super guard break immunity, that doesn't happen. He only gets locked down when he's basically debuffed, and you'll just see him holding his head but not actually getting head rocked or super guard broken. By contrast, the new uniform doesn't have that anymore. You can see right at the start that he is getting head rocked, and the only time that that doesn't happen is when the top proc, the super guard break immunity, actually triggers on the CTP. At that point I can actually move freely, as you see here. But the uniform itself doesn't have super guard break immunity, and he will be head rocked. You would think that this change would already make the new uniform much worse than the old one, but due to some of the other changes in his kit, namely gaining invincible from the second skill and being able to spam that, combo with the super armor kind of gives him pseudo super guard break immunity, and because the character has good survivability, he can also proc the top proc of a CTP, which for a PvP one will often give super guard break immunity anyway, so it's not really that much of a problem. The major significance of this change is mostly that you can't utilize a wide variety of CTPs that you could before, because you don't gain guard break immunity or super guard break immunity. So that would be things like a CTP of Rage or Regen, Patience, Transcendence, and so on. To give you a better perspective of how the new uniform compares to the old one, I did a variety of different tests. The first one that I did was to use Sentry without any kind of real supports, and basically just have him as a solo character versus 3 other meta characters who also didn't have supports on their team. With the old uniform, I was able to take out Knull and his immortality activation. I was able to take out both lives of Sentry, and I was able to take out 1 life of Wolverine, though he did end up taking out my first life of Sentry and then the second one before I could do the same. So overall, I did end up losing this fight, and it did stretch for a good amount of time, well over a minute. With the new uniform, I was able to fight the exact same team, this time actually winning and being able to beat the team around 20 seconds faster than with the old uniform, or in about 40 seconds total. With the new uniform, Sentry is dealing a higher amount of burst damage, so more damage in a shorter period of time, which is actually pretty impactful because you're allowed to bypass things like proc activations or limit the number of times that they activate. He also has higher skill priority, like on his 5th skill, and because he has that higher skill priority, some of his skills also have much more lockdown, meaning that he can basically not only lock down the opponent, but also prevent them from doing damage to him, which is also why he was able to complete this fight about 20 seconds faster or so. But regardless, you could also see that he did end up losing 1 life to Wolverine, so there are still counters towards him, and one of them being Wolverine. So the main differences between the old uniform and the new uniform are basically that he ends up dealing more burst damage, he has more survivability, and that's mostly due to the fact that he has higher skill priority, that he can go into his skills to be able to not only lock down, get healing, but also do more burst damage. You can see a clear example of that in these first 2 clips where I'm using the old uniform to fight Knull with double supports to see what Sentry can actually do, and it's to no surprise that without any actual supports on my end and just using Sentry outright, he isn't really able to do much of anything and just ends up dying. This isn't the case with the new Sentry uniform. Even without the assist of strong supports on my team, I'm actually able to take down a Knull with double supports, which is actually quite crazy because I'm not using a damage proc, and I can push Sentry's performance even further if I was able to add in strong supports like Colossus, for example, or characters like Ebony Maw or Phil Coulson. The major changes on paper that Sentry gets for this uniform are that he gains 5% damage reduction, he gains skill damage and bonus damage, which he previously didn't have, he gains an additional 10% healing on his 2nd skill, as well as invincible on it for 5 seconds now, which was swapped out with the damage immunity that was on the 5th skill, and was for 6 seconds, but 5 seconds, and being able to spam the 5-second invincibility frequently with the 2nd skill, which has obviously the iframe ignore and is prioritized, is a much better improvement. On top of this, the new uniform also provides him with 2 additional seconds where he has all the debuffs removed on him. The previous was 2 seconds, this one is 4. He also has 5% additional ability to ignore damage reduction, The old uniform was 15, this is 20, and he also has 1 second shorter cooldown on the 5th skill, allowing him to be in that more frequently. Even though these numbers seem a little bit trivial, the uniform gains a lot of survivability because he essentially is almost always invincible, always having the 2nd skill up, and constantly getting healed by 30%, which essentially doubles to 60% if you have high enough recovery. So he's healing half his health every time he uses his 2nd skill, and also gaining invincible. But on top of that, his high skill priority means that he rushes into the skills first and is protected from additional damage because they are basically full iframes that also lock down the opponent with super guard break on them. Again, to put into perspective the difference in performance between the old uniform and the new one, I did 2 additional tests with the old uniform, and this time adding in those high-level supports like Phil Coulson and Colossus, and even by adding those in, I still wasn't able to recreate the performance with the new uniform and not having those supports. I still ended up losing versus a Knull that had double supports with this kind of setup, and it occurred basically twice because I did obviously 2 tests to see for more consistency, and that was the outcome for both of them. Keep in mind that if I had the CTP of Greed in this setup, it is possible that I could have potentially won with the old uniform and the double supports, since Greed usually ends up performing a little bit better once both teams are basically stacked up with supports, usually 2 on both ends. So the major changes to Sentry's uniform that aren't mentioned on paper in the patch notes are how the 2nd and 5th skill function. Like I mentioned multiple times already, it's that they have higher skill priority. So oftentimes, if Sentry goes into the 2nd skill and then follows up with the 5th skill, if the opponent tries to knock Sentry out of that 5th skill, he'll immediately jump into the 2nd skill very quickly, whereas previously he'd either get CC'd or have some kind of lockdown where he wouldn't get into that skill quick enough to be able to heal and stay alive to basically repeat his skills. The fact that he can get into the 5th skill so quickly with this uniform is often the reason why he can stay alive, and also the compound reason on why he can deal more damage and lock down the opponent. Because oftentimes versus characters like Knull, for example, when they use the 5th skill and Sentry was supposed to use his 5th skill with the old uniform, Knull would just use his 5th and Sentry would stand around and basically end up taking damage. With this new one, he'll go into the 5th skill as well and then follow up with the 2nd. It also seems like with this new uniform that the 5th skill lingers for a lot longer than the previous 5th skill on the old uniform. And this is important because once Sentry uses the 5th skill and then follows up with the 2nd skill, he essentially knocks out whatever character is using their skills into that pool of damage that the 5th skill is providing. And by him constantly doing this, going into the 2nd, 5th, it's going to basically burn out the opponent's kind of debuff removal, and that'll make them susceptible to being locked down. This is often why you'll see the new Sentry uniform actually being able to take out Knull even if you're not using a damage proc, because he constantly bombards the opponent with debuffs where they can't cleanse it. Even Knull spamming that 2nd skill will eventually drop out of the 2nd skill into the 5th skill, and Sentry will go into his 2nd skill and just keep him locked down on that, which will allow him to do way more damage than the previous Sentry uniform could, and also keep him alive because of the lockdown. There currently is a big debate on which CTP is the most ideal option for the new Sentry uniform, and the best advice I can give from the testing that I've done and the fights that I've seen is to just use the same CTP that you're currently using. If you had a damage proc or CTP of Greed, then I recommend you just stick with that. And if you had something like CTP of Conquest, then I would just stick with that. If it works, then there's no real reason to change it. And the character largely functions the same as he did before, just much better or to a higher degree. I will say though that at a high level of PvP competition, once supports start being stacked up and you get mirror matches, that I think CTP of Greed might end up getting a bit of an edge because you gain such an advantage from ignoring the damage reduction from your opponent and stacking up that damage proc on top of it. Also, if you don't have a totally maxed out PvP build, it might be a little bit more advantageous for you to go with the CTP of Greed to be able to take out the opponent's sentries that are stacked up where you previously couldn't do it unless you had a damage proc. For manual timeline, however, I think that a Conquest is a great option because you don't necessarily need the damage proc. You can just get that same amount of damage by spamming through various skills that you wouldn't on auto, so you would need the survival instead. On top of that, if you're not using Sentry with full supports, so 2 supports, mainly just using maybe 1 support and 1 other strong meta character, then a Conquest also functions very well. If you're using Sentry on manual or to counter an opponent's Sentry, have a character at the start you can swap off from and move to the side to avoid the kind of line damage second skill that the opponent's Sentry will use. Immediately go into your second skill, and the first skill that you will have off cooldown is the 4th, so hold that down to hide in iframes, and then hold down the second skill again whenever it's available. From there, you hold down the 5th skill, so that once the opponent comes out of their skills, you have that 5th skill pool of damage ready, and then immediately go into the second skill. So basically it looks like second skill, 4th skill, second skill, 5th skill, and then second skill. It's usually how you'll take out the first life, then you reposition and hold down the second skill. The opponent will do the same, so that you basically stay in that iframe ignore invincible, then immediately hold down your 5th skill so that you get that pool of damage, and then you just follow up with the second skill to take out the opponent since they're getting hit by the 2nd and 5th at the same time. I know it sounds like a bit of a mess of skills, but you'll get used to it after a bit of practice. When you take down Sentry, you're probably going to face off another top meta character, and you'll only have either your 4th or 3rd skill available. You can use either one, but just make sure to hold down the second skill after so that you can follow up with the iframe ignore damage. For the most part, the general rotation that you want to stick with is just the second skill into the 5th skill, and then just repeating that cycle over and over. But at the start, you kind of have to mix in some other skills like the 4th so that you can hide in iframes. If you do end up dying though, it's advisable to go into the 5th skill first, since the opponent will just wait there, and the 5th is fast enough where you can follow up with the 2nd right after, and then have the 2nd skill back off cooldown to do your rotation again. It's also worth noting that the 3rd skill is much slower now to deal damage, but does provide him with the advantage of repositioning, sort of like Thanos' iframe ignore skill. So he can basically jump behind opponents, which is very effective versus certain characters like Adam Warlock, for example, where you can just avoid all of his damage outright. Other ways you can counter Sentry are with Knull. You basically do the exact same kind of rotation that you would with Sentry. You open with the 2nd skill and then the 4th skill to do area damage, then spam the 2nd skill again, and that usually will take out the opponent. When they respawn, you do the 2nd skill and then use the 5th skill to hide from the Sentry's damage, and then finish off with the 2nd skill. Another way to counter Sentry is with Silver Surfer. He is still susceptible to reflect damage, though it is tougher to take down than before, and you likely won't be able to take down a Sentry with just 1 life of Surfer. You probably try taking out at least 1 life of him through the reflect. If you get lucky, you can get both, but you'll obviously have to have other meta characters to be able to have a more consistent team versus him. As you saw from the clip, the general rotation that I use is if you're getting locked down, you just hold down and try to spam the iframe ignore 3rd skill. But if the character is respawning and you have time to use other skills, then ideally you want to use the 4th skill to leave an area damage there, then go into your 3rd iframe ignore skill to do the damage and reflect back on top of that. So with the latest improvement to Sentry, you can actually now use him as a solo character with double supports. He is viable since his survivability is good enough and his damage is also good enough, where you can take on opponent Knulls that have double supports. They can actually go toe to toe, and you can see that in this case I was actually able to win the fight completely. It does become a little bit trickier when you're facing off versus opponent characters that have another meta character and a support, since you're not tailoring your 2 supports specifically for the entire team, but more so for one character or another. As you saw in the timeline testing before, Wolverine is a good candidate for taking out at least 1 life of Sentry, and then if you pair Wolverine obviously with another Sentry and a support, should be able to sometimes take out that 2nd life. But because mine was stacked towards or against the opponent's Sentry, because I had Ebony Maw support, I was actually able to win this fight completely because I was able to win the one-on-one once Wolverine was taken out of the equation. Generally, I would say try to avoid double support stacking Sentry, because unlike Knull, whose Agent Venom support can't be countered by Molecule Man, you can actually do that versus Sentries, or you can just end up taking out one of his lives through other means, either Wolverine, Adam Warlock, or Reflect from Silver Surfer and other characters. That's actually the last test that I did. I threw a low effort team with Silver Surfer, knowing that he would probably die, but it would end up wiping out the opponent's Sentry. So if you're having trouble, you can just do this and take out Sentry, and then clean up the rest of the team after pretty easily. The improvements to his skill priority, repositioning, damage, survivability, and AoE lockdown, he's obviously going to be a top pick for Otherworld Battle, and will definitely provide you a noticeable improvement versus the old uniform. You can see in this particular test where my Sentry was basically the last man left standing and was able to lock down and just out DPS the rest of the opponents on the other team. With the new uniform, the fact that the 5th skill lingers on for so long is pretty impactful in Otherworld Battle, because opponents can essentially just spawn into the damage and basically be one-shot. This is something that the old uniform doesn't do as well, but still does. However, with the new uniform, Sentry can also immediately go into his other skills if he's knocked out of this skill. I know a lot of people aren't in Alliance tournaments, so this test doesn't really mean much to them, and it is only one test. Usually Alliance tournament, you have to do a lot of tests with a lot of different accounts, different builds and stuff to get anything conclusive, but I did find it interesting that in a mirror match and only using Agent Venom to support Knull, I was actually able to win this fight with Sentry as the primary character dealing damage and surviving. He was the last man left standing again, and the opponent was basically able to take out Knull that was boosted up by Agent Venom, but wasn't able to take out Sentry. So it's very possible that in Alliance tournament or very high-end level PvP fights, it could be more advantageous to actually support or buff up Sentry over buffing up Knull. But I don't know how it goes when you're doing double supports on Sentry versus double supports versus Knull. It could be a little bit different than Alliance Conquest, since these stats are so kind of buffed up and changed in Alliance Tournament versus Alliance Conquest. Either way, I found these tests to be kind of interesting regardless, and shows you how much an improvement Sentry has made from the older uniform. So if someone was to ask me, is Sentry now the best PvP character in the game, I would arguably say that he is. He still is basically shoulder to shoulder with Knull, especially when you consider Agent Venom, because that support can't be countered and provides an insane benefit to Knull. So Knull should almost always be paired up with Agent Venom and is basically the standard that's used to compare to Sentry. But as standalone characters, Sentry versus Knull with no supports considered, Sentry is the stronger base character. With that said, for a lot of people, Knull will probably be a little bit stronger than Sentry because they have access to the team-up collection that provides all that pierce damage and additional stats. And the character also has immortality, which means that you have more access to that tier 4 skill, which can essentially just one-shot any character when it triggers. It's very possible that if Sentry gets that Thunderbolts team-up collection with part 2, that he might definitively be the top PvP option now, and also because you're not reliant on supports. In things like Otherworld Battle, for example, you don't need to fill up a slot using like a character like Agent Venom for Knull, and for symbiote characters, you can just use Sentry as is. So overall, if you are into PvP, I would definitely recommend this uniform for sure. It does provide meaningful upgrades over the old uniform, and in terms of the build, I broke it down. It's basically Conquest versus CTP of Greed. CTP of Greed if you lack some of the damage, or if you're just dealing with a lot of teams being stacked up with supports, and a CTP of Conquest if you're more so focused on manual timeline and are able to pair up the character with another meta character and a support there. That should work fine as well. In the next video, I'll be taking a look at Elena. I got her to tier 4, so I'll be showcasing how she performs in both PvE and PvP, like I always do. But for the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this with other people. I put a lot of effort into it, and I think it could help a lot of people out, whether to decide to pick up the uniform on how to build the character, and sharing the video also helps my channel grow so I can make more videos like this. I always appreciate people taking the time to watch my videos as well, so thank you, but the video is now over.